In the fading light of the Western Roman Empire, the year was 376 AD, when the first distant thunder of hooves echoed across the Danube frontier. Thousands upon thousands of Gothic refugees, fleeing the relentless advance of the Huns from the eastern steppes, pressed desperately against the borders of a once mighty civilization. What appeared at first as a manageable migration would soon reveal itself as the spark that ignited decades of internal rot. The empire, already strained by centuries of economic decline, political corruption, and military overextension, stood on the precipice. Its marble columns still gleamed under the Italian sun. Its aqueducts still carried water to teeming cities, yet beneath the surface, the foundations were crumbling. The collapse did not announce itself with fanfare or sudden catastrophe. It began quietly, almost invisibly, as external war pressures exposed the hidden fractures within. No one in the imperial palaces of Ravenna or the forums of Rome could yet imagine that this frontier crisis would unravel the entire social and political order that had dominated the Mediterranean world for half a millennium. Life in the late Roman Empire before the Great Unraveling carried on with a deceptive sense of continuity. In the bustling markets of Constantinople and Rome, merchants haggled over spices from the east, grain from North Africa, and fine wines from Gaul. Farmers toiled in the latifundia, vast estates worked by tenant coloni who were increasingly bound to the land like serfs. Soldiers drilled in frontier forts along the Rhine and Danube, their armor and discipline still echoing the legions of Trajan and Hadrian. Citizens attended chariot races in the Circus Maximus, where the roar of the crowd drowned out distant concerns. Senators debated in marble halls, while emperors issued edicts from palaces adorned with mosaics and golden statues. Daily routines persisted: the smell of baking bread in narrow streets, the chanting of Christian hymns in newly built basilicas, the clatter of carts on stone-paved roads. Yet this surface normalcy masked a society exhausted by heavy taxation, rampant inflation, and a military that relied more on barbarian recruits than loyal Roman citizens. The empire's vast bureaucracy grew ever more corrupt, its currency debased, and its population depleted by plague and endless border skirmishes. Early warning signs flickered like distant lightning on the horizon, largely ignored by those in power. Decades of civil wars between rival emperors had drained the treasury and fractured loyalties. The division of the empire into eastern and western halves, intended to improve administration, instead created competing centers of authority. Economic decline accelerated as trade routes became unsafe, and agricultural productivity fell due to soil exhaustion and labor shortages. Barbarian groups along the frontiers grew bolder, testing Roman defenses with increasing frequency. Yet imperial propaganda continued to proclaim eternal victory. Tax collectors squeezed the curiales, the local landowners who formed the backbone of provincial governance, pushing many into bankruptcy or flight. The Christian church rose in influence, sometimes competing with secular power, while pagan traditions faded. These invisible pressures accumulated slowly: a weakened army, discontented populations, and leaders more focused on court intrigues than structural reform. The system appeared resilient, but its resilience was an illusion sustained by the inertia of centuries. As the Hunnic storm drove Germanic tribes like the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals toward Roman territory, rising tension gripped the frontiers. In 376, Emperor Valens permitted the Visigoths to cross the Danube as foederati, allied settlers, hoping to bolster his depleted forces. What followed was catastrophic mismanagement. Corrupt Roman officials exploited the refugees with exorbitant prices for food and supplies, sparking resentment and violence. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 became a shocking defeat, where Valens himself perished, and 2/3 of the Eastern Roman field army was destroyed. This single event shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. Waves of migration turned into invasions. The Rhine froze in the brutal winter of 406, allowing Vandals, Alans, and Suebi to pour into Gaul unopposed. Britain was abandoned, its legions recalled to defend the core. Internal instability mounted as usurpers rose in the provinces, further dividing Roman resources. Cities began fortifying their walls not against distant threats, but against neighbors. The once open countryside grew dangerous. Trade contracted, and fear settled over the provinces like a persistent fog. Key decisions and fatal mistakes compounded the gathering crisis. Successive emperors, often weak or short-lived, relied on barbarian generals like Stilicho, whose loyalty was questioned, even as he fought desperately to hold the West together. Honorius, the young emperor in Ravenna, made the fateful choice to execute Stilicho in 408 amid court paranoia, removing one of the last competent defenders. Heavy taxation to fund endless campaigns pushed the middle classes into poverty and the poor into banditry. Attempts at reform, such as settling barbarians as federates within the empire, only accelerated the erosion of Roman identity and control. The sack of Rome by Alaric's Visigoths in 410 sent psychological shockwaves across the Mediterranean. The Eternal City, untouched for 8 centuries, fell to plunder. This was not yet the final end, but a devastating symbol. Emperors in the West became puppets of barbarian warlords, their authority hollow. The failure to maintain a unified command, to integrate rather than alienate migrating peoples, and to address the deep economic malaise proved irreversible. Every short-term military expedient deepened the long-term structural wounds. The moment the system began to fail arrived not with a single dramatic battle, but through cascading breakdowns across the empire. By the 420s and 430s, central authority in the West had effectively collapsed in many provinces. The Vandals crossed into North Africa, seizing the breadbasket of Rome and establishing their own kingdom. Attila the Hun ravaged the Balkans and Gaul, extracting immense tribute before his death in 453. Roman legions, now mostly composed of barbarian auxiliaries, fought other barbarians for control of shrinking territories. Infrastructure crumbled, aqueducts went unrepaired, roads became overgrown, and large estates turned into self-sufficient fortresses. Urban populations declined as people fled to the countryside. The monetary economy fragmented into barter. Emperors like Valentinian III struggled to assert control, their writ barely extending beyond Italy. The deposition of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer in 476, was almost an afterthought, a quiet administrative acknowledgement of a reality that had already taken hold years earlier. The collapse unfolded as a slow suffocation, province by province, city by city. Human consequences of this internal unraveling were profound and harrowing. Entire populations faced displacement, famine, and violence on a scale that shattered social bonds. Refugees clogged roads, carrying what little they possessed, while plague and malnutrition claimed countless lives. In once prosperous Gaul and Hispania, villas burned, libraries were looted, and knowledge preserved for generations vanished into ash. Families were torn apart as men were conscripted into ever-changing armies. Women and children suffered the brutal realities of siege and sack, starvation behind walls, massacre when they fell. The proud Roman citizenry, heirs to Cicero and Virgil, found themselves subjects of Germanic kings who adopted Roman titles, but ruled by tribal custom. Social hierarchies dissolved, the senatorial class lost power, slaves gained opportunities in the chaos, and the church emerged as a stabilizing force amid the ruins. Fear became a constant companion. The dread of the next raid, the uncertainty of tomorrow's food, the silence where bustling forums once echoed. Daily life transformed from ordered routine to survival amid decay, with the scent of smoke and the sounds of marching feet replacing the rhythms of commerce and law. In the long term, the historical impact of this war-triggered collapse reshaped the trajectory of Western civilization. The unified Roman world fragmented into successor kingdoms. Visigothic Spain, Ostrogothic Italy, Frankish Gaul, laying the foundations for medieval Europe. Latin language evolved into the Romance tongues, Roman law influenced emerging codes, and Christianity spread as the dominant faith, preserving elements of classical learning in monasteries. Yet the loss was immense. The centralized economy, sophisticated engineering, and vast trade networks withered. The Dark Ages that followed saw population decline, technological regression, and cultural contraction. The idea of a universal empire endured as a dream, inspiring Charlemagne and later Holy Roman emperors, but the reality of unified Roman rule was gone forever. Barbarian migrations brought new blood, new customs, and new vitality, but at the cost of centuries of instability. The fall demonstrated how external military pressures, when combined with internal weakness, could dismantle even the most formidable civilization, sending ripples that defined Europe for 1,000 years. The echoes of Rome's collapse still resonate through history as a haunting reminder of fragility. What began as frontier skirmishes and refugee crises exposed the empire's inability to adapt, revealing how war can act as the ultimate catalyst for internal dissolution. Cities that once commanded the known world faded into villages clustered around ruined amphitheaters. Roads built for legions now served wandering tribes. The grand narrative of eternal Rome gave way to localized power and feudal bonds. Yet from these ruins emerged the seeds of something new, the blend of Roman, Germanic, and Christian elements that would birth the medieval world and eventually the modern West. The silence that fell over the forums was not merely the absence of sound, but the quiet before new voices arose. No empire, however grand, is immune to the forces it fails to master. The collapse reminds us that civilizations endure not through past glories, but through constant renewal, and when that capacity fails under the weight of war and internal decay, the fall is both inevitable and transformative. As the last Roman lamps flickered out across the West, a profound transformation had already taken root. The world that emerged from the ruins was poorer, more fragmented, yet alive with potential. Historians would later debate the precise causes: lead poisoning, moral decay, military weakness, but the undeniable truth lay in the interplay between external threats and internal vulnerabilities. War did not destroy Rome alone, it accelerated processes long underway, turning manageable problems into fatal ruptures. The Danube crossing of 376, the sack of 410, the abdication of 476, these were milestones on a longer journey of disintegration. Today, as we examine the remnants of forums overgrown with weeds and aqueducts standing as skeletal monuments, we confront the same fundamental questions faced by those who lived through the end. How does a society recognize the warnings, and can it change course before the point of no return? The story of Rome's fall is not merely ancient history. It is a mirror held up to every civilization that believes itself eternal, whispering that the collapse, when it comes, often begins not in the clamor of battle, but in the quiet failures of governance, economy, and unity. The final chapters of the Western Empire unfolded against a backdrop of fading glory and encroaching shadow. In Italy, Odoacer ruled as king, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople in a gesture of nominal submission to the Eastern Emperor. Yet the West had truly become a mosaic of barbarian realms, each preserving fragments of Roman administration while forging new identities. The human cost lingered for generations, lost knowledge, disrupted trade, and a collective trauma that reshaped memory and myth. Legends of past greatness sustained the survivors, even as daily existence grew harder amid ruined infrastructure and contested lands. The Church, with its network of bishops and monasteries, became the primary repository of learning and order, bridging the ancient and medieval worlds. Environmental factors, including possible climate shifts, added further strain to already burdened societies. Through it all, the process of collapse revealed itself as neither swift nor merciful, but a grinding transformation where old structures dissolved and new ones coalesced slowly from the debris. In reflecting on this era of rupture, one is struck by the inexorable logic of interconnected failures. External wars provided the pressure, but internal weaknesses supplied the fractures. The Roman experience stands as a testament to the delicate balance required to sustain complex societies. When that balance tips, through over-reliance on military solutions, neglect of economic foundations, or inability to integrate newcomers, the consequences cascade across generations. The once unified Mediterranean world splintered, setting the stage for the rise of feudal Europe, the eventual Renaissance rediscovery of classical roots, and the long arc toward modern nation-states. The silence that descended over the western provinces was filled eventually by new sounds: the chants of monks, the hammers of blacksmiths forging knightly armor, the voices of emerging cultures. Rome did not vanish entirely, it transformed, its legacy enduring in law, language, and aspiration. Yet the cost of that transformation was the loss of an era, a reminder that even the mightiest powers can be brought low when war exposes the rot within. The story lingers, haunting in its lessons for our own time.